Hello everyone, welcome to my studio and my channel. My name is Mark and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to take a very close look at this remarkable drawing by Michelangelo. I'm going to copy it to the best of my ability and then attempt to apply what I've learned by doing a drawing of my own. And as always, along the way, we'll touch on art history, talk about historical materials and techniques, and why copying old masters like Michelangelo is so beneficial for your artistic training. Let's get started. While there's no need for me to give you the biography of Michelangelo, we should talk briefly about the history of his use of pen and ink, of which we have relatively few examples. Michelangelo's initial training was as an apprentice in the workshop of the Florentine painter Domenico Ghirlandaio. And though Michelangelo, with his usual arrogance, later denied having studied there, the influence of his first teacher's pen and ink style, with its long, straight, and dense layers of mesh-like hatching, is plainly evident. Something that can be said only of very few old masters, Velázquez maybe, also Van Dyck, is that Michelangelo seems to have come into this world fully formed, meaning that his earliest work exhibits not only complete mastery, but also a uniquely original artistic vision. In this copy of a fresco from the Brancacci Chapel by Masaccio, likely done when Michelangelo was still in his teens, we see him already making Ghirlandaio's hatching style entirely his own. And while Ghirlandaio's pen strokes are light and suggestive, Michelangelo's rendering, at least in the more elaborate areas, are dense and leave nothing to the viewer's imagination. The continuously shifting angles of long hatching describe the forms of the cloth with a sculptor's precision. It really feels like Michelangelo was carving rather than drawing, which is why I describe this style of cross-hatching as chisel hatch. This densely fused hatching style remained consistent throughout Michelangelo's long life, and this, along with the fact that he never dated his drawings, make dating his work difficult. Most of his pen and ink work seems to be limited to his younger years, with very few examples after 1508. Of course, given Michelangelo's propensity to mistreat and destroy his drawings, we can't say for certain that he abandoned using pen and ink in the later part of his life. Pen and ink technique, at least among us mere mortals, requires constant maintenance, and I find that if I don't use a pen, even for a few weeks, I get rusty. Given the complete virtuosity in the few surviving examples of pen and ink work done in his later years, I suspect that he remained a habitual user of pen and ink throughout his life, but that much of those drawings are lost. This Satyr is one of those rare examples from that later period, done with certainty after 1522. How do we know it was done after 1522 if Michelangelo didn't date his drawings and this isn't a preparatory study for a commission? We know this because of a very unique feature in this drawing. Buried under all of the hatching is a red chalk study of an idealized female head done not by Michelangelo but by a studio assistant named Antonio Mini, who was employed in Michelangelo's workshop, but only after 1522. This red chalk study was likely an attempt to copy one of his master's works, possibly this one. The original is now lost, and we are left only with this copy by another, luckily more able assistant. This Antonio Mini, as far as I know, left no work of his own, but is immortalized in Michelangelo's most famous advice for young artists, which he scribbled next to this quick pen and ink study. It says, draw Antonio, and don't waste time." Let's zoom in on the Satyr and speak in detail about Michelangelo's hatching style. One of the things that makes Michelangelo's drawings so compelling is his unparalleled understanding of form. In the Satyr, and really all of Michelangelo's drawings, there's a relentlessly inquisitive exploration of shapes, a tireless effort not just to depict chiaroscuro, light and dark, but to fully understand what is being drawn in a three-dimensional way. That obsession, of course, comes from his training as a sculptor. Sculpting forces you to examine form in ways drawing and painting do not, but I also credit the use of cross-hatching in building his abilities as a sculptor, since this way of drawing forces you to look beyond the patterns of light and dark, and in that respect, I think it's fair to say that Michelangelo not only drew like a sculptor, but sculpted like a cross-hatcher. This is evident in some of his unfinished sculptures, like this Pietà, where the incomplete forms have been literally cross-hatched with a toothed chisel. The vocabulary of marks in this drawing is huge, but can be divided into three types: long, evenly spaced hatching defining larger planes, shorter, relatively straight lines refining smaller planar shifts, and all kinds of curving strokes, rounding edges, adding contrast and texture. The question is, how did Michelangelo get those very long, even strokes? With something I call the elbow stroke. This is done by planting the elbow on a table and using it as a rotation point. One thing I found is that working from the top down creates a thicker end of the bottom, which is not ideal. But if you work the other way, from the bottom up, the strokes are more uniform all the way through. This method, with a little bit of practice, creates very long, even strokes, but it's limited in terms of the angles that can be comfortably produced. But you can always shift angles by rotating the paper, though this produces additional problems in that you can't always see exactly what you're drawing. The shorter lines are produced in the regular way, from the wrist. The trickiest thing about Michelangelo's hatching is the consistency of width and density of his strokes, which, with few exceptions, are spaced the same distance apart. It's those shorter lines that Michelangelo uses line variation. This makes sense since line thickness is more easily controlled in shorter strokes, and that the shorter strokes serve to add contrast and texture, something line variation does extremely well. Note that in some places, such as the temple and the side of the nose, the hatching is done at a right angle. This is something I advise against in my cross-hatching videos because the square intersections right-angle hatching produce give a strong suggestion of flatness, which fight against our attempts to create a sense of curving form. However, in this case, he's depicting planes that are indeed flat, so right-angle hatch is perfectly appropriate. Despite the seeming busyness and multi-layered nature of the strokes, Michelangelo does practice a conservation of hatching layers, limiting the hatching to no more than 4 layers in most places. In many cases, instead of building strong darks with a large number of layers, he uses a sneaky trick, putting down 2 layers of dense hatching at slightly different angles. This is a great way of going very dark, but is definitely hard to control and not for the faint of heart, especially if your pen writes on the wet side. You can see Michelangelo use this trick to create dark accents in the drawing, though for the larger areas of dark, such as around the eye socket and the lips, he probably used a brush. Another technical feature commonly found in Michelangelo's ink drawings is the use of several values of ink, a lighter ink for the majority of the drawing, with a darker ink for the darkest shadows and the occasional accent. In the drawing of the Satyr, we see considerably darker ink around the ear and at the corner of the eye. The choice to use darker inks here might seem arbitrary, but Michelangelo is actually doing quite a sneaky thing. Strong contrast and texture make things in your drawing look closer, whereas softer contrast and softer textures make things look further away. Since the ear is the closest thing to the viewer, drawing it with ink that is darker than anything else in the drawing will make it pop forward, giving the drawing an even stronger three-dimensional quality. Before I begin the copy, let's briefly touch on what materials were used to make the drawing. The study of the female head is done with a pale, hard red chalk using many layers of single directional hatching that are still visible in the neck and in the back of the head. Red chalk is an unusual material in that it's actually somewhat resistant to water, allowing you to go over it with ink wash, which is what Michelangelo does at some stage in the drawing. You can see the areas of pale wash clearly in the hair, but he seems to have applied it in the shadows as well, where it mixed slightly with the red chalk underneath, creating a beautiful light reddish brown. The brown ink used here is called Bister and was made from soot collected from the burning of wood. James Watrous, in his indispensable book titled The Craft of Old Master Drawings, gives us a detailed recipe involving the boiling, straining, and condensing of soot created by the burning of wood and the addition of gum arabic as a binder. Bister ink had the advantage of extreme transparency and richness of color and was overwhelmingly the most commonly used brown ink in Old Master drawing. As for the pen, Michelangelo was working with a quill, a pen made from a bird feather, such as a goose or a swan. The process of selecting the right feather and preparing it for use was quite elaborate, but a quill in the hands of an expert was a much more versatile tool than any steel nib, with the ability to be cut in many different ways and with different degrees of flexibility. Unfortunately, as great as those historical materials are, I don't have any of them at hand, nor are they commercially available. And while I plan to make a detailed video where I show you how to make both, for the time being, we're going to substitute them with modern approximations. Let's finally get going on my copy while I go over what materials I'll be using. Since my channel is watched by so many fountain pen enthusiasts, I'm going to stay faithful to my audience and choose from my many fountain pens. Michelangelo didn't employ much line variation in his pen and ink work, so I'm going for something that's semi-flex. Though I have quite a few semi-flex pens, both vintage and modern, in my collection, my choice was limited by the fact that this drawing called for waterproof ink, since the plan is to go over my lines, ultimately with washes. That limits my choice of pens tremendously, since vintage pens are difficult to clean and I would never put a waterproof ink in them. Because of this, I decided to go with one of my modern semi-flex pens, one that I think I haven't featured before. This TWSBI Mini with a gold nib with a semi-flex modification by Gena Salorino of the Custom Nib Lab. It was a silly expensive purchase since the gold nib was first bought from fpnibs.com, a company out of Spain, before I sent it to Gena to be modified. But now that I have it, it's a remarkable nib that I can't stop drawing with, one that after 3 years of use has justified its cost. Almost. As for ink, my options were again limited because I only have one fully waterproof brown ink in my collection, Document Brown, made by DeAtramentis. Fortunately for me, it was fairly close in color, though lacking the vibrancy and transparency characteristics of Beaster ink. As for the use of ink of different values, I had decided that since the majority of the drawing was done with a lighter brown, to dilute the ink in the fountain pen, and then have a little container of darker ink that I could dip into occasionally anytime I wanted to go darker. That turned out to be a very good choice, since it meant I didn't have to switch pens, and also had a degree of control as far as how dark the ink needed to go. In areas where the ink was just a touch darker, I dipped a little. Where the ink needed to go very dark, I dipped a lot. As for the red chalk, I found that the Conte red chalk pencils I normally use were much too dark and coarse to mimic the very delicate drawing underneath all of that pen and ink. Fortunately, I have many red chalk pencils at my disposal, and I found one that was a closer match. This very light, colored, oil-based red chalk pencil made by Faber-Castell. Because it's oil-based, it's more water-resistant than I'd like it to be and wouldn't create the residue when gone over with the ink wash, but I figured it would still shine through the layers of pen and ink and provide a similar effect. As for paper, I chose something relatively smooth and able to take aqueous media, this very nice hot-press watercolor paper from the Italian manufacturer Cartiera Magniani. I really enjoy how this paper takes pen and ink and wash, and this being my very last sheet of it, I plan on buying more. As you can see, I deviated from Michelangelo's process here of working on top of a pupil's drawing of a female head. The thing is, while Michelangelo had leeway in the way he drew the satyr, I'm doing a copy of it and do not. So instead, I decided to utilize the red chalk stage to do a careful underdrawing. I was initially worried that the oil-based red chalk would resist the ink, but fortunately this turned out not to be the case. By the way, in the interest of saving time, and since I'm not doing an exact replica, I chose to leave out elements that simply do not interest me, such as the intricate braids and the headdress of the original red chalk drawing. Now let's talk about the practice of copying and why it's so darned important in artistic training. As I mentioned, this drawing of a satyr is drawn over a studio assistant's copy of Michelangelo's drawing. Whether the copy under the satyr was done out of the studio assistant's own initiative or by Michelangelo's orders, the fact that copying was such a common practice in the workshop of Michelangelo should be a strong argument in favor of copying as an indispensable tool. As we saw, Michelangelo himself copied extensively at the beginning of his artistic training, though his copies actually improved on the originals. The lessons learned from copying cannot be learned in any other way. You notice things that are usually overlooked and glean insights that remain hidden to the ordinary observer. Even in my very advanced age, after drawing for over 3 decades, I still learn something every time I copy a masterwork. The key, however, is not just to blindly copy, but to keep your mind active and seek out the principles that make the drawing you're copying great, principles that you can apply in your own drawing practice. So, what are those principles? The most important one, I think, is that when drawing, Michelangelo thinks like a sculptor, and the purpose of every stroke he puts down is to define the form. As a result, the hatching never feels decorative or arbitrary, but always serves to give greater and greater solidity with each overlapping layer. Let's take a closer look at the way Michelangelo carves those forms. Notice that flat, front-facing planes, such as the side of the nose and the temple and the muscle right below the zygomatic arch, called the masseter, are rendered with bold, right-angled hatching. Such even right-angled hatch creates a strong impression of flatness and should be avoided on planes that are either curving or side-facing. The side-facing planes are generally rendered with hatching done at slightly more vertical angles, such as the long, very dramatic series of hatches in the back of the neck. While larger planes are defined with long flat hatching, smaller ships are defined by a series of rounded, multi-directional hatching that rounds off all of those blocky forms. The lesson here is to look past the simple copying of shadow shapes and value and to think about what the forms are actually doing and how your hatching describes those forms. A deep understanding of form is not easily acquired, but I think the best way to do it is to learn how to sculpt. Sculpting develops a tactile understanding of form that cannot be acquired in any other way, which, when combined with finely honed drawing skills, will allow you to create drawings that are as solid looking as a marble sculpture. The next principle is the benefit of working with several shades of ink to better control delicate transitions of value. Again, this is a practice that Michelangelo used in most of his pen and ink work, and it allowed him to build up his values more gradually, leading to more subtle transitions from light to dark and carefully modulated variations in his shadows. Furthermore, it allowed him to employ a very dense, energetic style of hatching without worrying that it would be very messy and too dark. It also, as previously mentioned, allowed him to do that very neat trick with the ear, something much more difficult to do when using an ink of a single value. Another valuable takeaway is how incredibly consistent Michelangelo is in keeping the gauge between his hatch marks the same throughout. This is an important aspect of creating the illusion of form with hatching and a large part of what makes this drawing look so sculptural and solid. Such consistency in gauge allows the eye to be tricked into thinking it's looking at value, and part of what makes pen and ink drawings so exciting to look at. However, when an artist deviates, making the hatching wider in areas or finer in areas, it breaks the illusion, turning what should be perceived as value into texture. Michelangelo's hatching really is superhuman in its variety, long, short, straight, and curving, and yet all applied with stunning consistency of gauge. Copying this drawing felt like running a grueling triathlon, but the exercise made my pen work, especially those super long straight hatching marks, a bit better. Here is my completed copy. Frankly, this was a humbling experience, and my copy is far from perfect. In retrospect, I wish I had used one of my vintage pens, at least one of my modern pens fitted with a vintage nib, since they put down a wetter line that more closely approximates the quill. Ultimately, the most surprising lesson comes from the possibility that this supreme masterpiece was probably done as a joke. As a young man, Michelangelo had his nose horribly broken by a jealous rival. I believe this portrait of a satyr, with a flattened nose and somewhat disgusted, mocking expression, done over a drawing of an idealized youth, was a way to poke fun at his own appearance and the mediocre efforts of his apprentice. What's the lesson? Well, it's that if you approach every work of art, regardless of whether it's a Medici tomb or a scribble over a student's drawing, with the same passion and tireless curiosity, magic can happen at any time. Now let's see if I can apply everything I've learned to do a drawing of my own. Just for fun, I chose to work from this portrait of a very famous professional wrestler, Maurice Tillet, known as the French Angel, who was supposedly the inspiration for the ogre in the movie Shrek. I love the contrast between the brutally rugged profile of this man's face combined with a sly twinkle in his facial expression, suggesting that despite his intimidating appearance, this was a man of gentle disposition and intelligence, a very different type than Michelangelo's sneering satyr. I should note that Michelangelo was working from imagination in his drawing, whereas I'm working from a reference. While I'm perfectly capable of also working from imagination, and often do so, I felt like it would be a bit too much of a struggle when trying to do a drawing in the manner of Michelangelo to also work from my head. Plus, if I was working from imagination, we wouldn't have the benefit of seeing what I'm working from. As with the original drawing, I'm starting with a red chalk underdrawing with a touch of rendering. The difference here is that I ran out of that hot press watercolor paper that I like so much and had to switch over to this also very nice paper, which I believe is Stonehenger, a printmaking paper, in the pearl gray color. This drawing, like my copy, turned out to be more timid than I'd like due to my inexperience and discomfort with some of Michelangelo's hatch-making methods. The most difficult were the very even right-angled hatching on front-facing planes that were such a struggle in my copy of the Satyr. This hatch combination is very hard to pull off. It only works in very limited circumstances. Again, when you need a form to go very flat. So I'm not sure it's something I'm going to use, but some of the other tricks, like putting down 2 hatching layers with very slightly differing angles to create a strong dark, I'll definitely utilize. It needs to be said, however, that though many things can be learned from copying Michelangelo, he might actually not be the best artist to copy too often over a long period of time. Besides the tremendous difficulty of copying his work, there's an inherent danger to it, in that he's such a powerful artist with such strength of vision that his influence will overpower your own, making your work feel derivative. That is to say that there's a risk that people will see too much Michelangelo in your work and think, ah, that just looks like this artist is copying Michelangelo. There's a reason why great masters usually do not produce great pupils. It's hard to grow in the shade. As counterintuitive as it might seem, it might be best to learn from artists with slightly more modest abilities, so that their influence will be less powerful, and their work will not be as strongly present in your own. What artist should you copy? Not to tease, but that would be a fantastic topic for another video. Here is my drawing in the style of Michelangelo. I hope all of you found this video useful, and if you did, absolutely hit subscribe and let me know what you'd like to learn from me next. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye for now.